What's up, Covalence friends? So, I've got a really interesting series I want to do with you guys, and I want to make a centralized authentication portal. And so, what I mean by that is I want to have my users for app A be able to click on a link that takes them to a specific page and redirects them back to their site A and logs them in. And I also want users from site B to be able to click on a link, take them to the central auth portal, and log them into B. And so what this means is there's kind of a shared authentication state. So this application structure is going to entail a shared backend, or at least a shared authentication backend. And that means that we've got some cool workflow that we can execute. So for today, this is kind of day zero. I'll show you guys the backend itself and kind of the setup, because the fun part is the client side, where we actually make the portal and redirect to site A and site B. So backend wise, the reason why I wanted to try this out is because what if you're making just some really small applications that effectively could be, serverless, but you still wanted to do everything yourself, I guess. So if you wanted to make your own serverless server, we're not even really describing this architecture in that manner. I would say monolithic API potentially could be a descriptor of it, but if you want to set up your giant backend to have all of your typical setup, your authentication middlewares, your database connectors, if you wanted to have all of that set up for one project, then at a later date add in just a secondary but separate project into it, well, that's kind of the nice part about creating this monolithic API. You really just have some types to add, maybe a couple interfaces. You'll have one router to add, and then maybe a handful of queries to write, and that's it. All of your config is already taken care of. Your user registration, your user registers for site A. If they're using a shared auth database, that's a valid user for site B as well. So that's kind of where our head is at. That's kind of what I want this project to be. So this is going to be a centralized authentication server for our centralized auth portal. So looking at kind of what we've got thus far, let's go take a look at our server and just kind of evaluate our setup and trace everything down from there. So we have this setup function and a configure passport function that receive our app as arguments. And yes, I am using passport in this. We're just using local strategy and JWT strategy. But if you want to follow along from this repo or for this video series and maybe even clone this repo and add on your own separate strategies, go right ahead. That's the nice part about this, is it's extensible and you can really make it your own. So let's go take a look at these. Setup is kind of misnamed, misplaced. It's in my Middlewares folder, which I guess it's okay here because it is basically just applying all of our middlewares, but we're adding in a few middlewares here. We are applying our router here as well. And then, like I said, configure passport. We just set up our JWT strategy and local strategy. For local strategy, we have this little regular expression validator. So we've got a few little utility files here. But we have this is email validator that'll let you log in either with an email or username. So if the rec.body.email matches the signature of what we would determine is an email structure, this is the column that we search for in the database. Otherwise, we use username. So the MySQL library searching with dynamic columns and their raw queries, pretty cool. But that's what we utilize here. And I did have our index router linked up in our middlewares, so let's actually go look at that. We don't have anything currently on the API tree of things, so it's just a bare index at the moment, but Like I said, you've got free reign of this application. If you want to add a note-taking app, a to-do list app, something else, all you have to do really, like the biggest work is going to be adding a new file here and adding in some routes, and that's basically the majority of the work. But we've got our auth index linked up here, and we have it linking to a login and a register router itself. Register router, we have a smallish but decently sized user object, so we want to do some validation for it before we register the user. And I like automatic, logins, so we'll go ahead and sign a token and grant it to the user. This sign function is one in our utils folder that basically just daisy chains the jwt.sign function, except we have enforced the structure of the payload argument. And so that way, that ensures that upon registration and on login, we have the exact same credentials being provided. For our login request, Passport takes care of that for us. So we basically just grant the token. Great message, past Andrew YOLO. I really need to one of these days look through my personal GitHub and just like Control F for like YOLO or pizza or just like swear words, because I put kind of the dumbest stuff in all of my responses, especially for projects that are going to be like smaller ones for myself. I do stuff like that all the time, so whoops. But that's basically the structure of our middlewares and our login. Now, the cool part about this project is I still want these to be separate databases, and you actually can do that. You can create a database cluster and just selectively say with your queries which database to choose, and that's actually what we do employ strategy-wise here. So instead of creating like a config object of like one URL or having everything broken down, which if you wanted to do a database cluster, I probably would suggest just using URLs. Otherwise your config is going to start looking like this for multiple things. But I just kind of wanted to show what everything looked like broken up. And so what we have here is we have this object with, as you note here, I've got it typed as an object where every key is going to be one of these, and every value of it is going to be of the type this interface dbconfig. And so we've got some, I don't want to say like referential integrity, because like, or data integrity, because like you still need to validate these and, maybe crash your server in the event that they're not defined. Like if you can't connect to your auth database for a centralized auth server, that's very not good. So you probably do want to go ahead and validate that. But here it just helps me say like, oh, well, if I put like food as the key, this might break stuff, downstream, which it does. We actually reuse this type in our query function for a couple of different things. So we do have this kind of like single source of truth of like what databases we support. So TypeScript's going to get really angry really quickly if I don't have that set up right. Oh yeah, so like I said, if we can't connect to our auth database, or if we don't have like a token signing key, I'm not signing my tokens with undefined. That's also very not good. So we crash the server in the event we can't find that environment variable. But yeah, so we end up with this SQL object that has, all of these child objects of these configs, and I just have these placeholders, but auth is actually referring to a real database that we've got linked up thus far. So in our database index, we are going to be creating not just a singular pool, but instead this pool cluster. And so instead of giving this pool cluster one of those config objects, we actually will give it all of those. And so it basically acts as a hash or an object. You kind of just give it a key and a value, And so we use object.keys of our config object to loop over it. And for every database key that we have, we just invoke pools.add. We pass in the key and the value. So key is the database key, which is going to be auth, foo, or bar, and then the SQL object at that specific index. And so how we use it is, this is a structure I typically will utilize for most of my MySQL based backends, just because it's nice and repeatable, except here we have a few extra steps. So usually speaking, I will write a query function that takes in a generic that defaults to the MySQL OK packet in the event I'm not doing like a select or a stored procedure or something. And so that way we don't have to type like a majority of our requests. It'll just auto, do that for us, which is really nice. And we have a few arguments. So if you've been a fan of or have at least in the past written raw queries yourself, you're used to passing in a SQL string and an array of values for your library to safely escape. And here I actually have an additional argument in the center, database key. And so we can actually, when writing every individual query, we will select which specific database to utilize. And that's why I defined that type there. So I can't select in my queries an invalid database. Otherwise, TypeScript's going to yell at me a lot. But this function returns a new promise that resolves with that generic type we provided above. And then within this, we have one extra step than what I'm used to. Normally, I have something looking like this. And it's nice and lightweight, but we can't just directly query our pool. Which pool? We have multiple databases linked up here. And so we take our cluster and call the getConnection function, and we pass in that string key that we provide in the query call itself, and that selects which pool we'll be utilizing. And then from there, we have that pool argument given to us, and we can actually execute our query as normal. So that's kind of the structure for our database query function. And that means upon actual utilization, it's not too bad from like what an additional user object might be. Like I don't want to have something like this in production, but like if I had a function to select all users, yikes, definitely don't want that. So we'll say select all from users, which database? Well, we have that DB keys type defined here, so I can at least choose something, from here. So if I try to say like authentication, TypeScript's going to be pretty upset with me saying authentication is not in DB keys. So I'm like, oh, whoops. TypeScript's right. I'm wrong. It's always the status of things. So we just say, okay, well, auth. That's what's in there. So having that type defined just kind of helps make everything safe downstream, makes you write safer code. That's the beauty of TypeScript. But this is basically it. So when we're going to be adding a new project on the back end, we'll just be making a new query file, adding in our config info, and then creating some routes, and then maybe defining a couple interfaces. But as far as all of the other server setup goes, not really a whole lot for us to do. So I hope you guys enjoyed kind of getting a little preview of what's coming out after this video 0. So if you want to, go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel just so you can get notified when I provide the next in this series, or just to check out any of our other videos. And until then, I'll see y'all later.